Once upon a time, in a land where the sun burned the earth golden and the rivers carried songs of old, there were villages that breathed with both beauty and sorrow. The fields stretched wide with tall grasses that swayed like dancers, and the air often carried the sound of drums and laughter from children chasing each other barefoot across the earth. The people worked hard in their farms, planting grains and yams, raising goats and chickens, and building homes from mud and straw that stood strong against the winds. Life was simple, and even though food was not always plenty, joy still found its way into the corners of their lives. Mothers sang as they ground grain, fathers told stories at night under the stars, and children sat with wide eyes, dreaming of becoming strong hunters or wise leaders. But beneath this beauty, a shadow lived. Freedom was not something they could hold on to tightly. Raiders from faraway kingdoms or hired by greedy traders came like storms. They did not announce themselves with words but with the sound of pounding hooves and the sharp clashing of iron. They came to capture the young and the strong. They came to tear families apart. Men were bound in chains, women cried as they were dragged away, and children screamed as they were taken from the arms of their parents. Those who survived were left with scars, not only on their bodies but deep inside their hearts. In this world of fear and silence, where people lived knowing danger could arrive at any hour, one girl's story began. Her name was Amara. To the eye, she was no different from the other children of the village. She ran through the tall grass with her friends, laughed when her younger brother stumbled over his own feet, and helped her mother carry heavy clay pots filled with water from the stream. She loved the way the cool water splashed against her ankles and how the mud squished between her toes. Amara's voice was light, always asking questions, always curious, sometimes annoying the elders with her endless why. Her father, a man with a deep voice and strong hands, would often tell her stories as the fire cracked under the night sky. He spoke of their ancestors, warriors who had once stood proud against enemies, people who had fought to protect their homes and dignity. He told her that strength did not always mean carrying a spear, sometimes it meant carrying truth in your heart. Amara would sit wide-eyed, her little hands gripping her knees, as she listened to tales of men and women who stood tall even when the world tried to break them. She dreamed of those ancestors often, imagining herself in their place, running across battlefields, shouting brave words, holding high a torch that could never be put out. But she was only a girl, small and young, with no weapon, no power, and no voice that anyone would take seriously. In the village, girls like Amara were expected to grow into women who cooked, farmed, and raised children. No one thought of them as leaders, no one thought of them as fighters. That role was meant for men. Yet Amara's heart did not accept this quietly. Still, fate had its own path. The world outside her dreams was harsh, and Amara's days were filled with chores, helping her mother grind grains, keeping watch over her little brother, collecting firewood and fetching water under the heavy sun. Sometimes she paused to listen to the elders speaking in hushed voices about raids that had happened in neighboring villages. She saw the way their faces grew tense, the way the laughter in the village would suddenly fade when someone mentioned the sound of horses at night. Fear lived in every hut, hiding under every smile. Amara was too young to understand the full weight of what slavery meant, but she could feel the heaviness it left behind. She had seen old women crying at the river, mourning children who had been taken. She had seen fathers sit silent, staring into the fire for hours, their hands shaking but refusing to speak of what they had lost. These silent wounds taught Amara that their world was fragile, and one day, it might shatter around her too. Her father tried to shield her from such thoughts. He told her stories of courage not only to remind her of the past but to give her hope. No chain can break a spirit that refuses to bow, he would say. Amara carried those words inside her, not yet knowing how much she would need them. Because the day was coming when chains would find her, when her laughter in the fields would turn to screams, and when her life would be tested in ways no child should face. But on this day before the storm she was still just Amara, the daughter of a farmer, a girl with bare feet and bright eyes, running through the golden grass as the sun set and the shadows of fate crept quietly toward her village. Amara was only 13 when her world shattered. It was a night like any other. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the fire in the village center crackled softly as families drifted into sleep. The moon hung heavy, casting silver light over the huts. Amara had curled beside her younger brother, listening to the distant hum of her father's voice as he spoke quietly with her mother. Sleep pulled at her eyes but dreams never came. Instead, the silence was broken by the thunder of hooves. The ground shook before the people even understood what was coming. Then came the fire. Torches soared through the air, landing on roofs of straw, turning homes into infernos. Screams rose into the night, piercing the calm like blades. Men in iron and leather stormed the village, their faces hard, their voices shouting orders in a language Amara did not understand. The village woke in chaos, mothers clutching their children, fathers rushing with spears and sticks, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and unprepared. Amara was yanked awake by her mother, her small hands pulled urgently. "Run!" her mother cried, but before they could escape, the raiders were already among them. She saw men struck down, women dragged by their hair, and children screaming in terror. Amara clung to her mother's hand with every ounce of strength, her nails digging into her skin, refusing to let go. But the raiders were merciless. A rough hand larger than hers could ever imagine tore her away. She screamed, reaching out for her mother, who fought with desperate strength, but the blow of a weapon silenced her cries. Amara kicked and bit, but it was no use. A heavy rope tied around her wrists, chains fastened around her ankles, and she was shoved into the line of captives. The smell of burning huts mixed with the sound of sobbing, a night carved forever into her memory. In the confusion, she caught one last glimpse of her father, his silhouette fighting bravely but quickly swallowed by the chaos. That was the final moment she saw her family, her home, her childhood. The captives were gathered in the center of the village, their numbers too many for the heart to bear. Amara could see neighbors, cousins, friends, all broken into silence, their eyes wide with terror. Then came the mark. One by one, each captive was dragged to the side where the raiders carried irons glowing red from the fire. Amara's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The smell of burned flesh stung her nose before it was her turn. She fought, twisted, screamed, but strong hands pinned her down. The iron pressed against her shoulder, and agony ripped through her body. She felt as if her skin was on fire, her breath stolen by pain too deep to describe. Her scream echoed with the others, rising into the night like a song of sorrow. The mark was a brand of ownership, a symbol that she was no longer free, that she now belonged to the masters. For many it broke the spirit. For Amara it did something else. Beneath her tears she felt something burn hotter than the iron itself. It was not only pain, it was fire, and that fire would not die. The journey that followed was long and cruel. Days blurred into nights and nights into days. The captives were forced to march barefoot across sharp stones and dry earth. Chains clinked with every step, binding them to one another like cattle. Those who stumbled were whipped. Those who tried to run were struck down. The sun scorched their backs until their skin blistered, and the dry wind cracked their lips. Many cried until no tears remained. Amara's cheeks, once wet, became dry under the merciless sky. She thought often of her mother's hands, of her brother's laughter, of her father's stories. Each memory was a knife but also a shield. In her heart, she swore silently that this journey would not be her end. She repeated her father's words to herself, "No chain can break a spirit that refuses to bow." She whispered them under her breath when her body wanted to collapse, when her knees bled from the ground, when hunger made her dizzy. The raiders thought they had stolen everything from her, but they could not see the fire in her eyes. Other captives walked beside her, their faces pale with despair. Some whispered prayers, others wept for children left behind. Amara listened, but she also spoke. When the guards were far and the night was quiet, she murmured words of courage, reminding the younger ones to hold on, telling them stories she had once heard from her father. Her voice was small, cracked with exhaustion, but it carried strength. Some looked at her and nodded, their eyes sparking with a little light in the darkness. Though her wrists ached and her body weakened, Amara carried something the raiders could not chain. She carried a vow. Her chains would not be her grave. The fire on her shoulder, the mark meant to silence her, had instead become a promise that one day her pain would turn into power. The masters believed that branding broke the spirit. They thought the chain was the end of hope. But Amara's spirit did not bend. Deep inside her heart, she had already begun to shape her chains into weapons. Amara's days in bondage stretched into an endless blur of pain, sweat, and survival. The sun became her enemy, rising each morning only to scorch her back as she bent low in the fields. Her hands, once soft from carrying water and weaving mats, turned hard and blistered from cutting cane, pulling weeds, and carrying heavy loads from dawn until the stars reclaimed the sky. Overseers stood nearby with whips in hand, their voices sharp as knives. "Faster! Do not stop! Keep moving!" Every lash that cracked in the air reminded her of the punishment waiting for anyone who faltered. For many, the weight of the chains was not only on their ankles but on their souls. Men who had once been hunters now shuffled like shadows, broken and silent. Women who once sang to their children no longer raised their voices. Hope drained from their eyes like water spilled into sand. Years of suffering crushed them until they accepted the cruelty as life itself. To survive, they bent their heads and gave what was demanded. But Amara was different. Though her back bent under the overseer's eyes, inside she stood tall. She refused to surrender the fire that had been lit in her heart the night she was branded. Each day she observed, quietly, carefully, as if her mind was free even when her body was shackled. She noted how the overseers argued with one another when orders from the masters were unclear. She watched how one would drink too much palm wine and stagger, leaving gaps in the watch. She noticed how the guards grew restless when storms brewed in the sky, or how they tightened their grips on their weapons whenever the drums of distant villages were heard. Every weakness, every slip, every shadow of fear in her oppressors was stored in her memory. Her body labored, but her mind studied. And when the night fell and the world grew still, her spirit worked harder than ever. While others collapsed into sleep, too tired to dream, Amara whispered into the darkness. She would gather the youngest, those still tender enough to believe, and she told them stories. Stories of ancestors who fought with spears, of spirits who broke chains, of rivers that carried warriors home. Her voice was low, careful not to be overheard, but it carried a strength that lit sparks in the hearts of those around her. Some nights she spoke of her own village, painting pictures of children running free, of mothers laughing at the river, of fathers who sat proudly by the fire. Other nights she reminded them that no chain was made that could not be broken. "They think these chains hold us," she whispered, "but they hold only our bodies. Our hearts are still free. And one day when we are ready, our hands will be free too." The children listened wide-eyed, their small faces glowing faintly in the moonlight. Some of the older slaves would turn their heads too, pretending to sleep, but secretly listening. They had long stopped believing, but Amara's words stirred something deep within them, something they thought was lost forever. Her defiance was quiet, almost invisible. She did not scream at her masters or fight openly, for that would mean death. Instead, she resisted by living, by remembering, by refusing to let her spirit rot. While her hands bled, she dreamed of freedom. While the whip cracked, she planned. While others broke, she gathered strength from their silence. She began to notice the way others looked at her. At first, it was pity for a young girl forced into labor too heavy for her small frame. But as the moons passed, their gazes shifted. They saw the way she endured, the way she carried herself even when the overseers barked. They saw her lift a fallen woman from the ground when the whip had struck her too hard. They saw her whisper courage into a boy's ear after he had been beaten. She was not just another slave. She was becoming something more, though she did not yet realize it. The days dragged on, but so did Amara's determination. Each blister that healed left her hands stronger. Each scar that marked her body carved her spirit deeper. The overseers believed they were breaking her, but unknowingly they were forging her. Every cruel act became fuel for the fire burning within her. Years in chains taught Amara many things. She learned patience, the kind that waits for the right moment to strike. She learned silence, the kind that holds secrets even under pain. And she learned unity, the kind that binds hearts together when bodies are bound apart. While the masters thought they owned her, Amara was quietly preparing not only herself but also those around her. She did not know when or how, but she knew a truth that the masters could never chain. The day would come when these fields would not hear the overseers' whips, but the cries of freedom. Her body may have been bent under labor, but her spirit stood taller with each passing day. It began as a whisper, too soft for the overseers to notice, but strong enough to stir hearts that had long been silent. Amara had learned the truth through watching and waiting. When one person resisted, the punishment was swift and brutal. The whip tore flesh, the body collapsed, and fear grew deeper in the hearts of the others. But when two resisted together, when a man stood tall beside another, or when women lifted their baskets and refused to move, something changed. The masters grew hesitant. Their eyes darted, their voices tightened. For in those small moments, they realized what Amara already knew. Power was not in the hands of the few who held whips, but in the many who endured them. Amara began to nurture this truth like a seed. She did not speak loudly or openly, for that would have doomed them all. Instead, she used the tools her captors did not understand: songs, stories, and hope. As they bent under the sun, hacking at the fields, Amara would sing. Her voice carried like the wind, rising above the rhythm of the labor. To the overseers, they were just chants to keep the slaves moving in unison. But to the enslaved, the words carried a secret. Her verses wove messages of strength, hidden beneath the melodies of work. When one voice joins another, the chain grows weak. When one hand joins another, the chain will break. The overseers heard nothing but the rise and fall of a tired girl's voice. But those who listened carefully heard the fire beneath the words. They sang with her. At first softly, unsure, their voices trembling like sparks in the dark. But as days passed, the chorus grew. Soon the fields were alive with songs that were not only chants of labor, but hymns of defiance. At night, when the fires burned low and exhaustion should have silenced them, the enslaved would whisper. They passed along the message Amara had sown into their hearts. We are many, they are few. It spread from hut to hut, from lips to ears, until even the most broken among them began to murmur the words. Some still trembled with fear, but the seed of courage had been planted. Amara became the quiet flame at the center of it all. No longer did people look at her as just a girl. They began to turn to her in moments of despair, seeking her eyes for reassurance, her voice for guidance. She listened when others poured out their pain. She comforted those who cried for their children. And always she reminded them that their suffering was not endless, that chains were not made to last forever. One evening, when the guards grew drunk on wine and their laughter echoed carelessly into the night, Amara gathered a small circle of women and children near the edge of the huts. She spoke in hushed tones, her words steady but fierce. They want us to believe we are powerless. But we are the ones who work these fields, who build their homes, who feed their mouths. Without us they are nothing. We are the river and they are only stones trying to block our flow. The women nodded, their eyes shining with a light that had not been there for years. Children clutched their mothers' hands, listening as though hearing a bedtime story, but one filled not with dreams, but with promises. Amara's brand, once a wound of shame, began to take on a new meaning. When she bent to lift a basket and her sleeve slid down, the others did not see it as a mark of ownership anymore. They saw it as fire, a sign that pain could be transformed into strength. It was no longer the iron of her master. It was the iron of her will. Even the older men, those who had long accepted their fate, began to steal glances at her with quiet respect. They did not speak of rebellion openly, but they no longer silenced her either. In their eyes she saw a flicker of something dangerous, something powerful, belief. The change was slow, almost invisible to the masters who thought they had complete control. But among the enslaved, a current was building. When one was struck down, others now rushed to lift them. When food was stolen by overseers, the people shared more carefully among themselves. When a woman wept, someone placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered Amara's words. And when they sang in the fields, the songs carried higher, louder, until the air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of hope. Amara knew rebellion was not yet ready. To strike too soon would mean slaughter. But she also knew that rebellion had already begun, not with spears or swords but with unity, with courage, with the slow burning of chains in the hearts of her people. The masters believed they had branded her into submission. But unknowingly, they had branded the spark of a fire that was spreading through every soul around her. And though the night was still heavy, Amara knew the dawn was coming. The sun had risen cruelly that morning, pouring its heat onto the fields until the air shimmered. The enslaved bent low as always, their bodies weary, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the soil they worked. Among them was a boy, no older than 10, thin as a stick, his arms trembling as he tried to lift a basket half his size. Sweat dripped down his face, his knees buckling with every step. Amara had been watching him for days, her heart heavy with worry, for she knew he was too young for such labor. By midday the boy's body could no longer carry the weight. He stumbled, his basket tipping and spilling its contents across the ground. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then came the crack of leather, sharp as thunder. The overseer's whip was already in the air, ready to fall on the child's back. Amara's body moved before her mind could stop it. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around the boy, pressing him against her chest. The lash struck her instead, searing across her back like fire. Pain exploded through her, but her head did not bow, her eyes did not drop. She stood there, trembling yet unbroken, her body shielding the boy. The overseer's arm froze mid-air. For a moment, disbelief flickered in his eyes. This girl, this slave, had dared to defy him openly. Rage replaced his shock, and he lifted the whip again, but before it could strike, a murmur rose from the field. It began with one voice, then another, until dozens of low voices swelled into a sound the overseer had never heard before. The enslaved were no longer silent. They did not scream. They did not cry. They stood. Silent, unmoving, their tools still in their hands, their eyes fixed on the scene. The overseer barked orders, shouted threats, cracked his whip into the air, but no one scattered. Not this time. The men stood tall, their shoulders squared. The women tightened their grips on the baskets. The children leaned closer to their mothers, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. Amara turned her head slowly, her face pale with pain but her gaze blazing with fire. She looked at them all, one by one, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. She did not need them. The brand on her shoulder, the welt rising on her back, and the boy trembling in her arms said everything. For the first time the overseers felt a flicker of unease. Their whips were many, their cruelty well practiced, but they were outnumbered. The silence of the enslaved was heavier than shouting, more dangerous than screams. It was the silence of people who had remembered that they were not broken. That night, the village of captives gathered as they always did, but something was different. No one collapsed into sleep. No one wept quietly in the corner. They sat together, close, their eyes following Amara. She rose slowly, her back wrapped in cloth, her face shadowed by the firelight. The boy she had protected sat beside her, his small hands clutching her arm. When she began to speak, her voice was low, but it carried to every ear. Today they tried to break us again. But today for the first time we did not bow. Today for the first time we stood together. She paused, letting the words sink into the silence. Faces that had once been empty now leaned forward, hungry for every syllable. They believe these chains are our prison, she continued, lifting her wrists so the firelight glinted against the iron. But I tell you, they are our weapons. They can strike us, starve us, beat us. But they cannot live without us. We are the hands that work their fields. We are the backs that carry their loads. Without us they are nothing. And together, her voice rose now, filled with conviction, together we are stronger than their whips. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Some nodded fiercely, others clenched their fists, their faces alive with something they had not felt in years, determination. Amara looked at them, her eyes blazing like twin flames. How many more children must fall before we act? How many mothers must weep before we rise? If we do nothing, our sons and daughters will wear these chains. And their children and their children's children. But if we act now, if we turn these very chains into weapons, we can end this. We can break the cycle. For a moment, silence fell again. The fire cracked, the boy leaned against her, and the weight of her words pressed against every heart. Then, slowly voices began to answer. We are many. They are few. The whispers became louder, a chant rising from the ground like thunder. We are many, they are few. We are many, they are few. The overseers, sitting at a distance, stirred uneasily. They could not hear the words, but they could feel the energy, the unity, the danger building in the night. By the time the fire burned low, something irreversible had been set in motion. The enslaved no longer looked at Amara as a girl who whispered courage in secret. They looked at her as a leader. They looked at her as the voice they had been waiting for. And though their bodies were still bound, their spirits were no longer in chains. The night chosen for the uprising was one of silence, so deep that even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Clouds rolled across the moon, drowning the fields in darkness, as though the heavens themselves wished to hide what was about to unfold. The enslaved had prepared for weeks in whispers and in shadows, turning every piece of iron, every shackle, every fragment of their chains into weapons. Where others saw imprisonment, they saw possibility. Rusty links were hammered against stones until they broke into jagged blades. Shackles became clubs, their weight perfect for striking. Even the wooden handles of tools were sharpened into spears. The plan was simple but bold: strike when the masters were least prepared, in the hours when their bellies were heavy with wine and their heads too tired to lift. The guards had grown lazy over the years, certain that fear would forever keep the slaves obedient. They never imagined that fear had been smoldering into fire. Amara stood at the center of it all, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Men, women, and even children clutched makeshift weapons, their hands trembling not from weakness but from anticipation. She could hear their breaths, heavy and uneven, like a drumbeat before war. Her own heart raced, yet she forced her voice to remain steady. Tonight, she whispered, her words carrying through the night air, we stop being slaves. Tonight, we rise as people who will never bow again. A ripple of resolve spread through the crowd. Some nodded, others muttered prayers under their breath. The boy she had once shielded in the fields now stood among them, his small hands gripping a chain longer than his arm. His eyes no longer held only fear, they held fire, a reflection of hers. When the signal came, the howl of a lone wolf echoing from the hills, Amara raised her arm. The crowd moved like a single shadow, spreading across the camp. The guards dozed at their posts, their spears leaning useless against the walls. One by one they were taken down, chains looping silently around their necks, their weapons seized before a cry could leave their lips. Then came the moment of thunder. A guard stumbled, shouting as he fell, and the silence shattered. The fortress erupted with alarm. Torches flared, boots thundered against the ground, and the clash of steel rang through the night. Amara did not hesitate. She charged forward, her chains swinging like spears, their sharpened edges glinting in the flickering firelight. She struck with the fury of every lash she had endured, every tear she had shed, every life that had been stolen. Around her, the enslaved surged like a storm. Shackles slammed into skulls, jagged links tore flesh, wooden spears pierced armor. The masters shouted orders, but panic laced their voices. They had always ruled through fear, but fear was no longer theirs to command. Tonight it belonged to them. The battle was brutal. Some fell, brave men and women who gave their lives so that others might taste freedom. But their sacrifice only fueled the fire. For every friend who dropped, 3 more rose with cries of vengeance. Blood mingled with the dust, and the night was alive with the roar of a people who had been silent too long. Amara fought at the front, her body a blur of motion. Her chains whistled through the air, striking with the weight of years. A master lunged at her with a sword, but she twisted aside, the chain wrapping around his wrist. With a fierce pull, the blade clattered to the ground and she struck him down with a single blow. Another came, then another, but she moved with the rhythm of survival, every strike a declaration, I am not yours to command. Hours stretched into eternity. The night seemed endless, yet slowly the chaos began to fade. One by one the torches sputtered out, their flames trampled into the dirt. The cries of the masters grew fewer, their defenses crumbling under the relentless tide. By the time the first streaks of dawn lit the horizon, the fortress stood silent. The banners of the masters, once symbols of power, hung in tatters, torn down by the very hands they had sought to enslave. The walls that had caged generations were smeared with the blood of battle, but beyond them lay a freedom more real than any dream. Amara stood at the highest step, her chains still clutched in her hands, her body streaked with sweat and blood. Around her the people gathered, tired, battered, but alive. For a moment there was no sound, only the soft rustle of dawn's wind. Then, as if the earth itself exhaled, a cry rose into the sky. We are free. The word spread like wildfire, shouted from throat to throat until the air itself seemed to tremble. Tears fell, not of sorrow but of triumph. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers clasped each other's shoulders. The boy who had once collapsed in the field stood tall, his chain raised high, a symbol of victory. Amara closed her eyes, the sound washing over her. The brand on her shoulder still burned, the lash scars still ached, but she no longer felt their weight. What had once been symbols of her bondage were now marks of her strength. She opened her eyes to see the people watching her, their gazes filled with reverence. She had not only led them to battle, she had led them to freedom. And though the dawn revealed a land still scarred, still uncertain, there was no doubt in their hearts. The chains that once bound them had been broken forever. The morning after the uprising brought with it a silence unlike any other. The fortress that had once stood as a symbol of dominance lay broken, its walls smeared with the evidence of struggle. The masters were gone, their power shattered, but freedom, though sweet, came with challenges that no one had fully prepared for. The chains had been cast aside, yet hunger lingered. The fields were scorched, food supplies limited, and many of the freed were wounded or grieving for those who had fallen. Children searched for parents who would never return, and parents wept over the bodies of their sons and daughters who had fought bravely for a dawn they would not see. The people stood in the ruins, unsure of what came next. For years their lives had been dictated, when to rise, when to labor, when to eat, and when to sleep. Now, with no overseer's whip to command them, there was both a great void and a great opportunity. Some were afraid. Some argued. Some even wondered aloud whether freedom would be harder than bondage. Yet in the midst of this uncertainty, one voice carried through the chaos, steady and unshaken. Amara stepped forward, her chains still hanging from her shoulders, though now they were no longer tools of pain but symbols of victory. Her face was tired, her body bruised, but her spirit glowed with the same fire that had carried them through the night of battle. She reminded the people of what they had achieved together, that they had defied the masters who once seemed invincible, that they had risen as one body when for so long they had been treated as nothing. She told them that freedom was not a gift handed down, but something earned with blood, courage, and sacrifice, and that such a thing must never be forgotten. Her words lit a flame in their hearts once more. Slowly the fear began to fade. The people gathered the fallen and gave them burials filled with honor, marking each grave with stones so that generations would remember the price of their freedom. They shared what little food remained, dividing it fairly among families. Even in hunger there was no greed, for they had learned the strength of unity. As the days turned into weeks, villages that had once lived apart began to unite. Messengers carried word of the uprising beyond the fortress, and scattered groups of enslaved people heard the news. The masters were not untouchable, chains could be broken and freedom could be won. Small groups traveled to join Amara and her people, bringing stories of their own suffering and their own dreams. They rebuilt not as one village but as many villages bound together, united by courage and shared struggle. Amara did not claim herself as a ruler. Instead, she listened, guided, and reminded them of the lessons carved into their scars. She organized councils where every voice mattered, where women, men, and even the young had the right to speak. In the evenings, fires lit the night sky as the people sang songs not of sorrow but of defiance and hope. Women crafted new verses celebrating the girl who had once stood in the fields with fire in her eyes, the girl who had turned her chains into spears. Her name became more than a name. Children whispered it in play, pretending to be warriors who fought with courage instead of fear. Elders told her story as a lesson, teaching that dignity could not be stolen, even in the harshest of chains. Travelers carried her tale farther and farther, until villages that had never seen her face still spoke of her as though she were one of their own. The brand on her shoulder, once a mark of humiliation, became a badge of honor. Mothers pointed to it when they told their children stories at night, saying, "This mark was meant to break her, but instead it became her fire." Young girls, once told that their voices should remain silent, now lifted their chins higher, believing that they too could lead. Boys no longer saw themselves only as laborers, but as protectors of their people, following the example of the girl who defied the whip. Years passed, but Amara's story did not fade. Even when the wounds of battle had healed and new harvests grew in the soil, her memory remained. Festivals were held where songs of her bravery echoed through the valleys. Drums beat in her honor, not to worship her, but to honor the spirit of resistance she had ignited. In time, her tale grew into legend, not of a queen or ruler, but of a girl who reminded the world that chains could be turned into spears, that silence could become a battle cry, and that dignity could never be bought or sold. Generations later, when children gathered around fires to listen to the wisdom of their elders, they would still hear the story of Amara. They would hear of how she was torn from her childhood, how she bore the brand of slavery, how she bent under toil but never broke, and how she rose to lead her people to freedom. Her life became a thread woven into the fabric of their identity, proof that even the smallest voice, even the weakest body could spark a revolution. And so, though Amara lived and died as a daughter of the soil, her spirit became something greater. It became a beacon carried in every song of resistance, in every whispered prayer for courage, in every raised fist against injustice. Her chains, once meant to enslave her, had become the very symbol of freedom for countless others. The people never forgot her, and they never let the world forget either. Amara was not just the girl who fought back, she was the voice of her people, the strength of the broken, and the fire that turned despair into hope. And her story, carried from tongue to tongue, became immortal.